There's a way to raise your student financial confidence level by 56%. Intuit for Education offers free personal and professional financial education with real-world tools that empower students to achieve long-term success. Learn more at intuit.com/highered. This is College Matters from The Chronicle.
I'm never saying not to counter speech that we find deplorable. I'm just saying you don't use a disciplinary code to go after pure speech.
As the Israel-Hamas war continues, the recent release of 20 living Israeli hostages has provided real but tempered hopes for a sustained peace. But the long shadow of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict still looms large in the United States, where college campuses have been at the epicenter of fierce debates over Israeli policy. Those debates gave rise in spring of 2024 to protests on many college campuses, fueling concerns about antisemitism. In response, Columbia and Harvard universities have both in the past year adopted into policy a common definition of antisemitism, effectively forbidding behavior that crosses that line. But should universities be in the business of refereeing this? That question has long been on the mind of my guest, Kenneth Stern, who directs the Center for the Study of Hate at Bard College. Stern helped to draft what became known as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of antisemitism, which Columbia and Harvard now employ. In something of a twist, though, Stern isn't too happy about how the definition he helped to create is now being used. Ken Stern, welcome to College Matters.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Ken, we've seen a lot of pressure on college campuses to rein in anti-Semitism since October 7th. This inspired a lot of pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses, and that pressure has really intensified, as you know, during the second Donald Trump administration. In a couple of high-profile cases over the past year, universities have responded by adopting a new definition of anti-Semitism into their non-discrimination policies, and that's what we want to talk to you about. This all sounds a little wonky, though, when I I describe it to you. Incorporating a definition into a policy. Why is this significant, Ken?
Well, it's actually, the text is not new. The text came out in 2005 based on what was then called the European Monitoring Center's working definition of anti-Semitism that I helped craft as the lead drafter. It was in the aftermath of the Second Intifada and the collapse of the peace process. And this group was looking at how to take the temperature of anti-Semitism across Europe. So it correctly noticed that all the different countries that had to put data together didn't have a common frame of reference. So it wanted one. That's why in 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance adopted it and has been pushing it. And the problem to me is, and we can talk more about the details of this, is that the core of what it's being used for on a campus is as a speech code to say certain things are beyond the pale, and we lose so much of what's important in combating anti-Semitism, including making sure that students aren't harassed, aren't bullied, aren't threatened, aren't intimidated. But the focus has instead gotten to be on what people say, what people tweet, what people teach, and that to me is problematic.
So, Ken, as you've said, this definition has been incorporated into some university policies. Colleges will point to the text and say, this is what anti-Semitism is, and if you do this, we're going to punish you. But let's start with the text itself. What is the definition? What does it say exactly?
Sure. There are many examples about Holocaust denial, calling Jews as for killing Jesus and so forth. The ones that are contentious are the ones about Israel. And I'll tell you two of them. One of them talks about denying Jews the right to self-determination, and this is e.g. that claiming that the creation of the state is racist. And another one is requiring of Israel behavior not expected of any other democratic country. But it was never to say if you believe those things, if you say those things, that therefore you are an anti-Semite. And where it's gotten, abused, I'll give you an example from the second one. The intention, when I drafted that, again,
Second one being applying this
double standards. What we were thinking of is, okay, imagine if Detroit was being bombed by Canada. Would anybody say, America would not have the right to somehow respond to that? But people were saying when bombs were coming into Israel, either from Lebanon or from Gaza, no, you shouldn't respond. So that was the thought process. You wouldn't expect a democratic country not to do something to defend their citizens from harm. The problem to me is not what the definition says. What I've learned over the last 15, 20 years is that in a political fight, anybody will take a weapon in hand, and a definition is seen by many people as a weapon to be wielded in trying to suppress speech they don't like.
And just so we clarify the history a little bit, so when you did work drafting this definition with other people in collaboration, the idea was scholars, people who monitor this internationally, need some common framework with which to talk about what is anti-Semitism, because it's a somewhat slippery term. That was sort of what you had in mind when you started working on this?
That's right. I mean, a number of things, but the primary purpose, the reason why it was built around examples, was to give data collectors some indication of what to include and exclude, and to give some consistency across borders and time.
And just to be clear, this definition is now most often referred to as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, and we've seen that specific definition incorporated into some university policies. But we're having a discussion about how this is applied, which is distinct from saying anti-Semitism is or isn't a problem in this country. And in fact, there have been plenty of studies showing upticks in anti-Semitism in the United States. In April, the Anti-Defamation League released a report showing 9,300 some odd anti-Semitic incidents across the U.S. in 2024, which was the highest number on record since the ADL started tracking these incidents almost 50 years earlier. So incidents on college campuses rose more steeply than those in other locations. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned about this, and I don't want that to get lost in our conversation. I assume you agree with that.
Oh, wholeheartedly. I've spent my entire career looking at issues of anti-Semitism. I was at the American Jewish Committee as the point person on anti-Semitism for 25 years. My work on it preceded that and has followed it, and hate, writ large too. No one is saying that anti-Semitism isn't an issue. What we're questioning is how to deal with it, especially on a campus. And what troubles me is, again, going after expressions about speech. We're talking about things that people chant, things that people say, things that people assign, tweets that people send. When we start focusing on those things, we lose so much about how we should actually be dealing with anti-Semitism.
Another example within the larger framework of these definitions that I don't think you mentioned is drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis.
Right.
I think this is something we should drill into a little bit,
Sure.
Ken, because it would not be uncommon to show up on a college campus and see a pro-Palestinian protest where somebody accuses Israel of genocide.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that would fit within this definition.
And that's part of, again, the problem of the definition, right? We can talk about whether Israel is committing genocide or not, but the question comes down to a campus. Students should be able to debate this. It's an important question, as you say. And when you try to use instruments to say, wait a minute, this is out of bounds, you're doing a disservice to everybody on the campus, including Jewish students who should be able to engage it. I mean, we just saw Charlie Kirk was assassinated. I can't think of anybody that I disagreed with, hardly more than Charlie Kirk, but I applaud him for going on a campus and said, prove me wrong. Why isn't, instead of saying, okay, you can't say, or we're going to get you into trouble, or it's going to be a Title VI violation if you say that Israel's committing genocide, why not just say, prove me wrong?
We should talk a little bit about why universities are adopting this definition in the first place. There's been enormous pressure on some high-profile institutions, Harvard and Columbia, to do more to confront anti-Semitism. And some have responded by saying, hey, we have this definition of it. We're going to incorporate it into disciplinary policy. Talk to me a little bit about the motives that, as you see them, I know you're not in the room, but the motives as you see them for institutions adopting this in the first place.
Well, I think they're getting pressured. I think they're getting pressured from, some people inside, board members and donors. I think they're getting pressured from the government. I think they're getting pressured by the lawsuits. And again, some of the lawsuits are alleging things that I think are worthy of alleging, spitting, shoving, attacking, harassing, and so forth. But, they're seeing this as an easy way to somehow control the pushback against what's perceived on campus. And it's, to me, a horror in terms of how they're doing it. I mean, we saw at Columbia, you have Rashid Khalidi saying, after they adopted it as part of the settlement with the Trump administration, I can't teach anymore about Palestine. You saw a Jewish professor, tenured, who's from a family of Holocaust survivors, who teaches about genocide and is worried she's going to get in trouble teaching about Hannah Arendt. So there's a lack of concern about academic freedom, I think, and I think this is an easy way to somehow placate. But part of this is, again, the seduction of what I was writing about 30 years ago about hate speech codes, is they become, the simple way we're going to deal with the problem. No, on a campus, what you want to do is you want to survey, you want to train, you want to build curriculum, you want to build ways for people to talk across differences. You don't want to have rules that say, this cannot be said. And one of the problems, too, is that we're now seeing a proliferation of definitions. So there's one of anti-Palestinian racism. There's one of anti-Hindu racism. There's one of Islamophobia. Are we going to start having rules for each of these things of what can be said and can't be said on a campus? That I find horrifying.
And Ken, my understanding of your position is have a harassment policy, have a bullying policy, have a discrimination policy. We don't need to go around defining every kind of ism. Help me understand the distinction, why you see that as a better path for these institutions.
Oh, sure, because I think the schools have an obligation to tell students, you're not going to be harassed, you're not going to be assaulted, you're not going to be, intimidated, you're not going to be a victim of true threats, and we're going to stand up should that ever happen. You should be disturbed by ideas. You want to come to college to really shake up your thinking as an 18 to 22-year-old. You're going to spend the rest of your life recalibrating, we hope, how you think about things, to think about where you may be wrong. We want to make you critical thinkers. We want to encourage you to try on ideas.
And I understand it's almost hard to talk about this without looking at a specific case, but it's certainly common to hear people in higher education say, you're coming to this place, you're going to hear some things you don't agree with, you've got to have a thick skin, this is part of intellectual discourse. I think the students who are concerned about this would say, yeah, but there is a point at which an environment becomes hostile, and it can become hostile based on speach. How do you respond to that?
Well, yeah. There's no question that speech can be used in a way that's hostile and can create that environment. So words can certainly harass. There's no question about that. But at the end of the day, you want to be able to have detailed discussions of things that cut you to your core, as long as they don't cross that line into harassment, intimidation, and so forth. And once you start defining the boundaries of what ideas are okay and are not okay, that's again undermining, what an education should be.
But that's not the way a lot of students felt after October 7th. There were students who felt they couldn't get access to buildings,
Absolutely.
All of these things.
Yeah, no, and I understand that when somebody is blocking somebody, which happened, when things happen like, at Cooper Union, other places, that's deplorable. That's not what I'm talking about. What people were talking about in terms of using the definition was saying, it disturbs me when somebody is chanting from the river to the sea. Mm-hmm. Those are the types of things. You don't need to use the IRA definition to look at speech, to look at actual harassment. And this becomes more complicated, too, because there's a whole other layer in this, which is that there's an internal Jewish debate looking at issues about how Jews should relate to Israel. And most Jews, including me, are Zionists, and Israel is important to us. But there's a growing number of young Jews, many of whom are involved with, if not now, in Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine, whose Judaism leads them to a position that's anti-Zionist. They can't square in their religious understanding how Israel could exist, how we treat the stranger and how we repair the world are important parts of their Jewish identity. Asking the adoption of IRA is saying you want the government, you want the administrations to decide this internal Jewish debate. They're deciding one side gets supported and the other side doesn't.
So just to clarify for listeners who may not know what you mean by IRA, IRA is shorthand for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. That's the organization that adopted this working definition of anti-Semitism we've been talking about. Let me come at this a slightly different way, though, Ken. Do you see any issue with a university saying we have zero tolerance for anti-Semitism?
It depends on what they mean. If they mean anti-Semitic bullying, threatening, so forth, it's the same with, zero tolerance for anti-LGBTQ things, racist things, so forth. I have no problem if that's what they mean.
I think the reason I ask it that way, sorry to cut you off, but I think the reason I ask it that way is what would follow from there is you can't say you don't tolerate something if you don't know what it is. And that's the rub.
Well, but the point is that, two things. One is, if you're talking about not tolerating it, I think you're talking about behavior and actual hostile environments and so forth. But, you don't have a parallel definition, just to put this into context. Nobody's saying, if you're saying we don't tolerate racism, nobody's saying, well, we don't have a definition of racism. Let's have a parallel one compared to the IRA definition. And let's include political examples, because that's what the Israel ones are, about opposition to Black Lives Matter, or opposition to the removal of Confederate statues, or opposition to affirmative action. Nobody's saying we need those markers to decide how to create a campus that is against racism.
Stick around. We'll be back in a minute. Hey, everybody. We're pleased to announce that College Matters recently earned a Signal Award, which recognizes excellence in podcasting. We're grateful to the judges who honored our work, and we want to thank you, our listeners, for supporting the show. If you'd like to congratulate us, the best thing you can do is to subscribe to our show and download it every week. And hey, do me a favor, encourage a friend to start listening too. Thanks so much. One of the top reasons students drop out of college is money. It's not just academics, it's financial stress. Intuit for Education provides free personal and professional financial education programs to schools with real-world tools designed to make an impact. Students can learn to manage expenses, learn about credit, navigate financial aid, and much more. It's a no-cost way for your institution to bolster retention and advance your mission in solidifying student success from their first year to their first job and beyond. Learn more at intuit.com/highered. Ken, one of the reasons that you're a compelling person to talk to is not only because you're an expert on this stuff, but there's an interesting arc to your story as somebody who participated in drafting this definition, who now has deep concerns about how it's applied. So that's kind of an interesting twist. You have other people who worked with you before who land differently on this, and one of them is Rabbi Andrew Baker. He's the director of International Jewish Affairs at the American Jewish Committee, which is a Jewish advocacy group. And he played a role along with you in drafting and adopting this anti-Semitism definition. I talked to him recently and asked him what he made of some of the issues you've raised about this definition chilling free speech. And I want to play you a short clip of what he said, if we can listen.
Now we can talk about the definition being misused, and you can debate whether universities should have speech codes at all. And if so, to what degree and how much speech and in what areas, should it be limited? That's all fair. The definition can be misused, but it seems to me the answer is not to say, well, let's have no definition. Really, let's educate people on how to use it.
What do you make of what Rabbi Baker's saying there?
Well, I worked with Andy for a long time, and he was very involved. And the reality is that it's taken on a life of its own. Again, it was intended to be a tool for data collectors primarily. Again, I said there were other purposes too, but that was the primary one. But it hasn't really been used that way. It's been used primarily to go after pro-Palestinian speech. And if you look at the IRA website where it has the definition, it links to an EU report on how to use it. And what it talks about is going after speech on campus, what could be taught. It goes even further. It talks about what groups can be funded.
But are you I think this is something Rabbi Baker wanted to know.
Sure.
I'm sorry to speak for him.
No,
but
please
do you still think this is a good definition of anti-Semitism? Let's set aside whether it should be used this way.
Listen, I think the definition, if it had been used for how we thought it would be used back in 2005 to do reports, to take temperature, to clarify hate crime, that would have been fine. It hasn't been used that way. It's been used to target pro-Palestinian speech. And so that's my concern. It's not the text of the definition. It's the weaponization of the definition. And one of the great ironies, if you look at the IRA website and talking about it, it's non-legally binding. Then why the heck are people pushing it in legislatures and in Congress? And if you want to look at one real frightening example of what almost happened, in Arizona, it passed to use it on educational K through 12 and presumably college too, and it gave an individual right to parents to sue teachers if something happened that was violative of the definition. And the governor actually vetoed it, thank God.
Ken, I don't want us to go off on too much of a tangent here, but
no.
there has been. No, I love a tangent. I'm an academic, Jack.
Tangents are fine with me.
Yeah,
go wherever you want.
No, but I mean, there has been some back and forth with you and Rabbi Baker about whether you're in fact the lead drafter of this or whether that's the right term. I really am not terribly concerned with this. Your involvement is not in dispute in some way of drafting this definition. What I am curious about, though, is the concern that by coming on shows like this and saying it's problematic the way this is being applied, that you sort of unwittingly, perhaps, make it easier for anti-Semites to get away with anti-Semitism, to not be called out for using coded language that is in fact anti-Semitic, because the nuance of your argument is somehow lost. And what comes off is the guy who wrote the definition thinks it's nonsense too. Do you worry at all about that? I know you can't control it.
No, I'm not ever saying don't combat speech or contest speech that you don't like, and you can call it whatever you want. But I'm saying don't use instruments of the state to suppress what teachers can teach and what students can hear. That's doing a disservice, and it's doing a disservice to Jewish students, too, who really do want to engage on these issues, and as I said, are on other sides of the issue as well. And I want to create the environment on a campus in particular where people can have productive discussions. And we can talk a little bit more about how to do that, but there are ways educationally, and I can spend a lot of time talking about ones that I think actually work. But when we get down to saying, what we want to do to deal with this is to have a cut and paste definition to look at speech, we absolutely blind ourselves to all those things.
And I should say that Harvard and Columbia, who have adopted this to some degree into policy, have both said, we can do this and not infringe upon free speech. So these institutions are certainly saying they think they can do both.
But the reality is they can't. Which is why you have, the professor who teaches genocide studies saying, I can't teach. You have Rashid Khalidi not doing it. And you have, going back, I wrote this book called The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine campus debate back in 2020, because I saw each side trying to suppress speech on the other side by different means, but each so much not liking the other side's speech that they were trying to suppress it, heckling on one side and interrupting speakers and academic boycotts, and then pushing IRA in particular as law on the other side.
And IRA, again, is shorthand for the Holocaust definition.
For the text, the definition of anti-Semitism with all these examples about Israel. People were taking this and hunting for lawsuits based on what a professor was teaching, what somebody said in a class, what texts were assigned. And I found that deeply troubling. And what I see with the adoption of the definition is now encouraging more hunting of speech on campus for both complaints and government action.
But how prevalent is the use of the definition, to your understanding? Only a few universities have actually, to my knowledge, actually said we're adopting this. Now, there is an executive order that we should talk about as well, but is this a pervasive issue in higher education, really?
I think so, because what you've seen is, whether there's a formal adoption or not, there's an awareness of the push by the Trump administration, and again, predating that, the use of the definition as a hook for lawsuits. And
we should say, just as a matter of fact, Ken, just sorry to interrupt you, but under a 2019 executive order, President Trump directed agencies that enforce civil rights laws to consider the working definition.
That's right.
So are you saying that is effectively putting universities on notice? Use this definition, even if you're not saying it out loud.
But you're right the way you described it. The executive order didn't apply, to say universities have to use it. It said the executive agencies had to use it. But if you're sitting as a general counsel of a university, you're certainly aware that this is the template that the administration is going to use, right? So, but what I've said, I was just speaking about this in Ann Arbor the other day. I said, but if you're the general counsel of a university, you have other obligations, and one of them is to academic freedom and free speech. It's not to become, just the enforcement arm of the federal government. But to your point, what I'm more worried about, and have been for a long time, even before the Trump executive order and the current administration, is the chilling effect, the knowing that people are going to hunt for speech about Israel they don't like and claim it's anti-Semitism and use the definition as sort of the stepping stone for Title VI, even where it shouldn't be used. They are going to get people to say, why am I teaching about Israel and Palestine? My PhD is in shtetl life in Europe. I'd rather teach about that. Nobody's going to sue me. Nobody's going to get my provost upset or my dean upset or my president upset or the alums upset. It's much safer. And I think we're at a moment where students really do want deep engagement on these issues, and the people that probably can bring it the most are the ones that are going to be most likely to be, should I really teach this or not?
Well, and I do think you're right that there are some students who certainly want to be able to have a civil and legitimate debate about Israeli policy. It's interesting, when that executive order was passed back in 2019, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, who was then a senior advisor to the president, wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times that I wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
He says, quote, "The Remembrance Alliance definition makes clear what our administration has stated publicly and on the record. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism." Is that a valid interpretation, in your view, even of the definition?
Well, the definition doesn't say that in so many words, but it's a valid reflection of how it has been used to say that every instance of expression of anti-Zionism, and again, remember, I'm a Zionist, but
and let's define that for folks
believing that Israel has a right to exist. So what Kushner was saying is that every instance of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and look at the reality. Clearly, there are times where anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Use the classic tropes about Jews and cut and paste them to Israel. Those types of things, absolutely so. There's times where it's clearly not. If, you or I or somebody else was a Palestinian, the existence of the state of Israel had an impact on you and your ability to control your life. If your objection is not because these are Jews doing it, but because this is what happened to us, that, to me, I may disagree with the implications of it, but I wouldn't call that anti-Semitism. And then, as I said before, the Jewish community, this is a big issue inside. The Jewish community would, I dare say, never call Satmar Jews anti-Semitic. Satmar Jews have a theological belief that you can't have a Jewish state until the Messiah comes. Okay? You have young Jews for whom, as I said before, their Judaism leads them to a place where they said, I can't justify a Jewish state because of what it means to Palestinians. How do you treat a stranger? How do you repair the world? I'm not going to say their theological interpretation is any less legitimate than the Satmar one, and I don't want to call them anti-Semites. There's a whole bunch of stuff in the gray area, which we have to live with.
So one of the things that I think invariably comes up in these conversations, Ken, is that there's a lot of attention devoted to anti-Semitism, perhaps less national attention devoted to Islamophobia, anti-Muslim behavior. Harvard released 2 reports from task forces back in April that looked at both in terms of climates on their campus. And one of the findings was that Muslims and Jewish people both felt to some degree physically unsafe on their campus. It was higher among Muslims. I think it was about 47%.
It was 56 to 26.
In any case, this isn't a contest, obviously.
Right.
But what do you make of that larger part of this discussion, which is to some degree the anti-Semitism conversation has overshadowed the Islamophobia conversation?
I wouldn't disagree, and I think there are political and other reasons for why that's the case. But again, if you're thinking as a college administrator or a faculty member or part of the college community, you have to realize that both of these things are happening. You've had instances of anti-Semitism, and you've had a lot of attention to it, but you've had Palestinian students who have been victimized by doxing. I've talked to professors who've said, wait a minute, I have kids coming into my office and closing the door and talking about their relatives in Gaza and things that they're hearing on campus, and I'm not equipped to help them. And also, let's not forget, there were some Palestinian students shot in Vermont, and there was a kid that was murdered post-October 7th. So there is a deep problem, not only for Jewish students. And one of the important exercises with the reports that you're mentioning is I think you have to read them in tandem, because they absolutely reflect what you're talking about. Each one is a mirror image of the other. Each is saying, wait a minute, the administration sides with the other side. They don't feel heard. And they could each give examples. And, one of them, for example, Jewish students, pro-Israel Jewish students may say, how come we have to follow the rules? The other side doesn't get to follow the rules, and we would never do that, and they get away with it. Why is that fair? And the pro-Palestinian folks say, wait a minute, why were you okay with the, bending of the rules during Occupy Wall Street or apartheid South Africa, but not here on this issue? And so I think all those things have to be engaged. So yeah,
students looking for moral and intellectual consistency from college administrators.
I know. Well, we're back to talking about double standards, but
right.
but the reality is that all those things are happening, and other things are happening. Let's not forget at the moment that if you're a Palestinian student or a pro-Palestinian student and you happen not to be, like me, an American citizen, you can get whisked away without due process for co-writing an op-ed. That's part of the environment too.
Talking about the visa revocation.
Yeah, visa revocations, or the student at Tufts, no due process, and the larger implications too. I mean, when I go to synagogues and talk about anti-Semitism and what worries me, I tell them 2 things that worry me the most are these. First, the vilification of anyone in American society. What I know from hate studies is that when you open that tap for seeing anybody among us as inferior, as a threat, to be demonized and feel good about it, it leads to anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism at heart, whatever definition you want to use, has these 2 elements. Conspiracy theory that says Jews conspire to harm humanity and giving an explanation for what goes wrong in the world. And there are reasons when you see that you're losing to people that you shouldn't because the leaders define them as somehow a threat to you, that makes anti-Semitic views more appetizing. And the second thing I say is that anti-Semitism and all forms of hate thrive the best where democracy is the most challenged. So one of the things that we've learned from history, look at the McCarthy period, look at the Pomeroy period, those were not good times for Jews. And if you're going to protect democracy, you have to protect due process, independent judiciary, independent press, thinking in schools, academic freedom, and probably most importantly, free speech.
You mentioned at one point, Ken, that there's something alluring about being able to define anti-Semitism. We have a policy. This is how we deal with it. One of the things that comes through in those Harvard Task Force reports is that this stuff is really messy. What is within the college's purview to deal with? What are the rules around how professors talk about things? I'll give you just a few examples. Students were concerned about messages on an app called SideChat. This is an online platform where people can post anonymously within a specific school, and it devolved into these hateful posts about Israel and Jews and the Holocaust. Other examples were instructors excusing class absences so students could go join in pro-Palestinian walkout demonstrations. all of these cases are untidy to some degree. Can you talk about sort of the complexity of what colleges are facing? Because you may not have a policy that really addresses all of this stuff.
Sure. No, and those are messy things, and you have people on both sides. And, again, to use a word that got some college presidents in trouble, context matters. So I got to ask this question in the Senate committee about the people giving extra credit for going to a pro-Palestinian demonstration. And I said, it depends, right? If your point is, you have to support this, and clearly that's why I'm letting you go and giving you extra credit, that's a problem. But I said to Senator Collins, on the other hand, if I were teaching that semester and there was a demonstration on campus and I'm teaching about issues about anti-Semitism and hate, I might give extra credit for students who went to the demonstration and then, put together a 2 or 3 page paper on the arguments they were hearing on either side. So context, does matter. But again, what's being missed in all of this, it seems to me, is what you can actually do. I'll give you a couple of examples. I loved it that a colleague of mine at Bard, who's involved with the Hate Studies Center initiative, saw that students were flinging around terms like genocide, settler colonialism, Zionism, anti-Semitism, right after October 7th. And she thought, we're a college. Why don't we actually have a class on this? What these terms mean? Let's bring in experts. Let's have discussions about why people hear them differently. Those are the types of things that I think are better initiatives than talking about what is our exact policy going to be when this happens or that happens and when are we going to live up to it and when are we going to bend it. And those are the types of initiatives that we want to get on campus to say to students, you may have strong opinions about this, but it will make you a better advocate if you understand more deeply with emotional empathy and intellectual curiosity why that otherwise friendly student that you interact in your dance class or physics class or math class or whatever has these views you define as not only wrong but potentially evil. Aren't you curious?
So, Ken, you mentioned at one point in this conversation the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And obviously, the country is going through a lot right now as it relates to speech, as it relates to political violence, as it relates to protest. What concerns you most about the moment we're in, and what would you like higher education to do about it?
There are lots of things that concern me at the most. The attacks on democracy, including the attacks on higher ed, the use of anti-Semitism as a wedge on this issue. I mean, J.D. Vance had talked when he was a senator about going after universities, much like Viktor Orban did. So I think there's an agenda there that transcends real concern about anti-Semitism. I think it's being exploited politically at the moment. And the universities are under assault. I think universities have to stand up. I think that the core blood of the university is academic freedom and free speech. And you can't sacrifice those principles and still be a university and still lead students to become critical thinkers, which we need for the next generation to succeed.
That's very well stated, Ken. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your views. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it too.
College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Sarah Brown, Carmen Mendoza, Ron Coddington, Joshua Hatch, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening. It's a fact. 70% of students claim they experience financial stress after arriving on campus. Intuit for Education offers free personal and professional financial education with real-world tools that empower students to achieve long-term success. Learn more at intuit.com/highered.